And I'd like to introduce the next speaker to you guys. Dr. Darrel Rutkin. He has earned a PhD in History of Science from Indiana University. He's currently a visiting professor at the University of Nevada, Reno, and specializing in the history of Western astrology. He has published widely in medical and Renaissance issues related to this knowledge and science. He's currently preparing a critical edition and English translation of Pico della Mirandolas against judicial astrology. So please welcome Dr. Rutkin.
I'm an old-fashioned scholar, so there will be no visual aid in this talk. First of all, I'd like to thank Ken and Hiro for inviting me, and Kuni and Claire for various ways they've helped me to get here and all of that. And thank you so much for coming. This talk will be sort of a background for Ryuji's talk on Pedro Gomez, because I'll be speaking about Christopher Clavius, the great textbook writer for the Jesuits in the realm of mathematics and astronomy. And I'll be speaking today on Clavius's rejection of astrology. We now know without a doubt that astrology was taught in the finest European universities in Italy and elsewhere from the middle of the 13th through at least the middle of the 17th century. A central and integrating feature of the arts and science curriculum, astrology was taught in different respects in three distinct scientific disciplines: mathematics, natural philosophy, and medicine. It was also practiced throughout medieval, Renaissance, and early modern society at both university and court, including at the highest levels of politics and culture. How and why, then, was astrology removed from this cultural and scientific centrality? In this talk, I will explore one piece of this complex puzzle, namely, the removal of astrology from its normal teaching in the mathematics course in the writings of Christopher Clavius, the influential educational theorist and textbook writer for the increasingly successful and international Society of Jesus, more popularly known as the Jesuits. He lived from 1538 to 1612. Before approaching Clavius's reforms, I should first provide a normative framework for understanding how astrology was taught at medieval and Renaissance universities by briefly describing the 1405 statutes for the University of Bologna, which provided a model for many other universities, especially in Italy. As prescribed in the 1405 statutes for the course in arts and medicine, the 4-year course in mathematics, astronomy, and astrology began with 2 years of prerequisites in arithmetic, geometry, and astronomy, including lectures on Euclid's geometry, the sphere of Sacrobosco, and the Alphonsine table. With this background, the students began their study of astrology proper in the 3rd year, with Alphabetius's influential elementary textbook and Pseudo-Ptolemy's Centoloquium, a fundamental astrological text for medical practitioners. In the 4th year, the student moved on to more advanced works in both astrology and astronomy, Ptolemy's Tetrabiblos and Almagest, and the On Uran's Unseen, an astrological treatment of medical questions. Astrology was also taught at Bologna in the 3-year natural philosophy course, which involves studying core Aristotelian texts, including those that provided astrology's natural philosophical foundations, namely On the Heavens, De Caelo, On Generation and Corruption, and the Meteorology. Finally, the 4-year medical course focused on medical texts, including those with a strongly astrological character, notably Galen's On Critical Days, which was study during each of the first 3 years. The educational structures articulated here were fully in place throughout the 16th century. Astrology's curricular centrality characterized the historical state of the mathematical disciplines when Clavius composed the first edition of his commentary on Sacrobosco's On the Sphere, De Sphera, in 1570. The last edition during his lifetime appeared in 1611. Clavius was a major pedagogical force for the newly emergent educational wing of post-Tridentine Roman Catholicism, the Society of Jesus, with its pervasive politico-religious agenda. To gauge Clavius's view on astrology, we shall examine several of his texts, all broadly programmatic, especially his tremendously influential commentary on Sacrobosco's best-selling 13th century textbook on elementary cosmology, the De Sphera. What makes Clavius interesting and important to historians of science and mathematics is the central role he played in almost single-handedly establishing mathematics as an important feature of Jesuit education. We should note that the subjects Clavius wrote textbooks for include 3 of the 4 subjects of the mathematical curriculum, or quadrivium, namely arithmetic, geometry, and astronomy. He was also deeply concerned to increase the status of mathematics. I will endeavor to locate Clavius's views on astrology in this context to see if we can detect what I will argue is his historically significant rejection of astrology from its teaching within the mathematical disciplines. In order to increase the status of mathematics, Clavius wrote several programmatic works in addition to the textbooks, including his contributions to the famous Ratione Studiorum of 1586 and 1599. These established the curriculum in mathematics for the Jesuit colleges that became so influential in the 17th century. As a starting point, let us briefly examine a work apparently of the 1580s entitled The Way in Which the Mathematical Disciplines Could Be Promoted in the Schools of the Society. Clavius begins by discussing his preferences for the teachers. They would need to have uncommon authority and erudition, and they should participate in public academic ceremonies and disputations, as the other masters do. This will increase the value of mathematics as a discipline in the students' eyes. Likewise, the teachers should have an inclination for their subject and should be selected and trained therein. They should not be distracted by other endeavors. Then he turns to the students, and I quote, "Secondly, then, it is necessary that the pupil should understand that the mathematical disciplines are useful and necessary for rightly understanding the rest of philosophy, and that they are at the same time a great ornament to all other arts, so that one may acquire perfect erudition. Natural philosophy cannot rightly be grasped without them, especially as regards that part which regards the number and motion of the celestial orbs, the multitude of intelligences, and the effects of the stars which depend on the various conjunctions, oppositions, and other distances between them." He continues, but we need not follow him. Are we thus to understand that a main reason why Clavius wanted the mathematical disciplines to be taught alongside natural philosophy is so that succeeding generations of Jesuit-trained students would be able to determine the effects of the stars on the terrestrial world, as modified by their conjunctions, oppositions, and the other astrological aspects that he did not enumerate? If there were no other evidence to the contrary, this would be a reasonable conclusion indeed, and would place Clavius squarely within the pre-modern tradition as a normal teacher of the mathematical discipline. But there is, in fact, other evidence from his textbook on the sphere, which points in a different, apparently opposite direction. We will look at 2 somewhat different discussions in the first edition of 1570 and in the 1591 edition. The discussion in both occurs in the preface under the rubric on the parts of astronomia. Before we turn to this specific treatment, however, we should first examine his general sketch of the mathematical disciplines, in which he describes their most basic patterns. First, he sketches out arithmetic, geometry, and music. Then he turns to astronomia, the science of the stars. Quote, astronomia, finally, has established a discourse about continuous quantity, or mobile magnitude, and investigates the invariable motions of the heavens and the stars, unquote. We should first note that Clavius immediately situated his overall discussion of astronomia within the explicit context of the mathematical disciplines and their relation to each other. The second point is closely related. Astronomia, the fourth branch of the quadrivium, is only concerned with celestial motion. In this sketch, there is no mention nor discussion of their effects, and thus of astrology. We can examine Clavius's views in greater depth by turning to a more detailed discussion in the section on the parts of astronomia. Clavius first discusses his indiscriminate usage of the terms astronomia and astrologia as referring to exactly the same subject matter, which was the normal pre-modern practice. He does say, however, that some people differentiate these terms to refer to two different subjects. Quote, at this time, the terms astronomia and astrologia are used for the same science, and therefore we also use these terms without discrimination in our commentaries. Although some mathematicians wish there to be such a distinction established between these terms, so that the term astronomia signifies that teaching which considers the movements of the heavens and the stars, but astrologia would be fitted to that art which, from the changes of the heavens and the conjunctions or oppositions of the stars, predicts future events and certain intimations and significations related to health and private affairs. This quotation is absolutely the same in the 1570, 1581, 1591, and 1607 editions. Clavius uses almost exactly the same language here as he did in the promotional work we just examined. All he has done so far is to say that some people make this terminological distinction between astronomia and astrologia with this meaning, but that he does not. He makes no judgment here on the content of the distinction. Clavius then makes the distinction he considers most useful, that between theoretical and practical astronomia. Quote, astronomia is divided into theoretical, that is contemplative, and practical, that is what operates and acts, unquote. Once again, every edition is exactly the same. Clavius first discusses the theoretical part, which deals with the motions of the planets and their locations. With respect to instructions, he divides its components into three parts. Textbook treatments, such as Ptolemy's Almagest and Regiomontanus's epitome thereof. Instruments, such as Ptolemy's common astrolabe or planisphere, Demophrysius's Catholic or universal astrolabe, quadrant, etc. And finally, tables, such as the Alphonsine tables, or those by Regiomontanus. Then he turns to Astronomia Practica. This is worth quoting in full. But practical astronomia, which other people call judicial or prognosticatory, that is what they call divinatory, orients all these things towards the practicalities of human life, for it contemplates complexions and the natures of both the signs and the constellations, and also of the planets and of the remaining stars. And it indicates which signs are hot, which cold, and which temperate, which are masculine, which feminine, and other things of this type. Again, it predicts future events in the world below from the motions of the planets and their orbs. But then the tone changes. But since many people have dared to add many things rashly and falsely to this part of Astronomia, and they wish to amplify this prognosticatory part in such a way that it became altogether superstitious and odious, and it is justly held to be suspect by the Church, and it was condemned in a marvelous manner by St. Augustine in his books on Christian doctrine. Therefore, I deem that we will say nothing whatsoever about this subject." Unquote. At first, Clavius simply describes what practical astronomia, namely judicial or predictive astrology, is. Then he notes that many people have added inappropriate materials. They have amplified it and made it superstitious. Therefore, and with Augustine's authoritative support, Professor Clavius determined not to teach astrology within the context of his mathematics course on the science of the stars. Thus ends this section of the 1570 and 1581 editions. So far, the 1591 and 1607 editions are exactly the same. The later editions then go on to simply enumerate 5 additional, more contemporary anti-astrological authorities to further support Clavius's position, including Giovanni Pico della Mirandola's famous disputations against divinatory astrology, and his nephew Gianfrancesco Pico's On the Foreknowledge of Things. On the basis of these explicit remarks in the several editions of his extremely influential textbook On the Sphere, Clavius's position seems crystal clear. Astrology will not be taught as a part of the mathematics course in the extensive international Jesuit educational system for which Clavius himself supplied the textbooks, thus removing astrology from one of its now well-established curricular foundations. The resultant pattern, the familiar structure of the quadrivium, but with mathematical astronomy now as the only science of the stars, was soon, of course, to become the normal pattern. This seems, therefore, to be a significant moment in the removal of astrology from one of its central locations in pre-modern science. But Clavius's position in the Sphere commentary itself is more complex than it initially appears from the focused treatment so far. It is clear that for practical purposes, namely for teaching astronomy as a mathematical discipline, Clavius completely rejected astrology. Nevertheless, there are 2 passages in the same preface which seem to indicate that there was also still room for astrology within the overall map of knowledge. Let us examine these passages in turn. The first passage occurs in the context of a 4-fold argument for why astronomia is the most important of the mathematical disciplines. According to Aristotle, Clavius begins, there are 2 main reasons for considering a science superior. First, the importance of its subject matter, and secondly, the certainty of its demonstrations. The text with which we are concerned treats the former. I will quote the second part of the argument. Secondly, astronomia is most distinguished because the celestial bodies are the cause of all things below, as it pleases Aristotle in Book 1 of the Meteors, where he says it is necessary that the lower world be connected with the superior movements, since all their power is derived from there. Likewise, in Physics Book 8, he asserts that everything is produced with the motion of the heavens mediating, and he does not hesitate to announce that the life of all things exists on account of that very celestial motion. Again, in Book 2 of De Caelo, he affirms that the heavens act on things below by the mediation of light and motion. Finally, in Book 2 of On Generation and Corruption, he testifies that because of the motion of the sun and of the other planets in the oblique circle, that is, in the zodiac, there come to be generations and corruptions in these things below. And he affirms the same thing in many other places, to which almost the entire band of philosophers are in agreement. Unquote. These texts are striking from our perspective. our perspective because Clavius here notes the major Aristotelian texts used to provide the natural philosophical evidence and authoritative support for an astrological worldview. Perhaps Clavius was trying to do what Giovanni Pico also tried to do, namely remove the astrological superstructure from its Aristotelian natural philosophical foundation. Unlike Albertus Magnus, Philip Melanchthon, Francesco Marolico, and others, however, Clavius here disregards entirely, but without actively rejecting, the astrological practices which this natural philosophy supported. Perhaps he was staking out a position of studied neutrality with respect to practical astrology. Since he himself did not teach natural philosophy or medicine to be discussed in a moment, Clavius did not need to take a strong and determined stand with respect to astrology's teaching in these disciplines. The second text to be examined appears in the following section on the utility of astronomia. This passage treats its utility for medicine, and hence for the third of the three scientific disciplines with which astrology was closely associated in pre-modern natural knowledge. I quote this section in full. But astronomia benefits medicine in such a way that Galen, the prince of physicians, warns sick people that they ought not commit themselves into the hands of physicians who are ignorant of the science of the stars. For he says that medicines offered at inappropriate times benefit little or not at all. Nay, rather, they often harm. These times can be known from the motions of the planets, which are the astronomer's business. Unquote. Unlike Flavius's studied neutrality concerning practical astrology's relationship to natural philosophy, he quite explicitly affirms its necessity for the physician by citing Galen's great authority. To sum up, let us re-examine Clavius's views in relation to astrology's three foundations in the scientific curriculum: mathematics, natural philosophy, and medicine. Clavius removed astrology from the mathematics course. In the vast network of Jesuit universities, astronomy was taught with Clavius's extensive textbook on the sphere from 1570 on. The sciences of the stars have now been severed in what appears to be a highly significant moment in astrology's removal from its now 300-year-long establishment within the normal patterns of pre-modern scientific instruction at the finest universities. This removal, however, was not dramatic. Clavius did not go on at length, nor did he fulminate. In this, he was very unlike the two Picos. But his peaceful removal seems nonetheless to have been very effective. Thus, in Jesuit mathematical training, one would still learn arithmetic, geometry, and astronomy, and at a very high level, including practical skills with tables and astrolabes. Jesuit students would thus still receive the necessary mathematical skills, but not explicitly oriented toward the study and practice of astrology. They would, however, study mathematics in close association with natural philosophy, and precisely those Aristotelian texts, among others, which provided the natural philosophical foundations for astrology as both a science and a practice. In natural philosophy and medicine, on the other hand, Clavius had much less of an impact, mainly because he did not write the textbooks. Regardless, he did not in any way attack astrology's Aristotelian natural philosophical foundations. In this respect also, he seems to follow in Pico's general train. In medicine, on the other hand, Clavius still seems fully to embrace astrology's traditional role. In this, of course, he is wholly unlike Pico, who attacked medical astrology at length in the Disputations. Thus, Christopher Clavius, who seems to have played a major role in the ultimate removal of astrology from the pre-modern map of knowledge, presents a complex intellectual profile, which does not map onto any sort of simplistic dichotomous framework. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Darrel. Thanks for a very interesting presentation of Clavius, and a quintessential figure in the development of astronomy and astrology in the early modern times. Now, we would like to open the questions to the floor. And anyone has a question?
Thank you very much for your extensive presentation. Yes, I'm very glad and excited that you chose the topic of your talk today, Clavius, because it's very important to understand what happened in this country and in China 400 years ago, because most Jesuits who worked as a missionary in these countries were trained in the Roman religion under the influence of Clavius, and for example, such important figure as Clavius and of course another Barnian, who showed their photo. And but my question is the background of the decision that Clavius made, his attitude toward the astrology. Do you think that you can understand this rejection of the astrology in the framework of Jesuit education or Jesuit world? What I want to say is that, do you think it's possible that the Vatican attitude toward the astrology could influence the Jesuits, or especially the Clavius attitude for such special particular area of study? So that's my question.
That's a very interesting question. What I found is that astrology was normal science in Italy as well as throughout Europe well into the 17th century. The only time that the popes or the Vatican had a problem with astrology, as far as I understand, is when some astrologer was stupid enough to predict the death of a pope. And that's why we get the famous bulls of 1586 and 1631 rejecting astrology. The other reason that astrology was ever rejected in the church was when an astrologer was also stupid enough to claim certainty for his predictions. No sane astrologer ever claimed that astrology was an exact science, unlike astronomy. So when there were these claims, then it became problematic. So, apropos of your question, Clavius wrote the first edition of the De Sphera in 1570, so before these famous papal bulls. And in that, he had already rejected astrology from the teaching of mathematics. That became somewhat more pronounced later on, i.e. after the bull. But in fact, it was still the same position. So why then did Clavius reject astrology? In fact, I don't really know. But there was some controversy in that there were some attacks on astrology, primarily from Vico del Mirandola. But that was still the minority position. But it must have affected Clavius. But it's striking in that early formulation of his views promoting the study of mathematics, he says explicitly that the students cannot understand the effects of the stars on the world without it. So I think it's an interesting question for further research. All I've done in this paper is to point out some of the complexity. Perhaps it was a personal choice by Clavius, but there's no indication that he fully rejected astrology, as we see in the natural philosophical and in the medical part. So I think the question is a very interesting one to pursue. But I do not have a final answer on the subject. I'm sorry to say.
Thank you very much. Maybe this is the last question.
Thank you very much. Maybe my question is out of your each of your paper. But I was wondering in the case of Kirker. Yeah. If Clavius is the starting point of rejection in Jesuit school, how about the case of Kirker? In his writings, there is some description of astrology and so on, or it's defended or it's rejected, and is any connection with this current law which started by Clavius?
It's a very interesting question. I know very little about Kierkegaard, and that's to some extent deliberate, because of course he wrote so much, and he's such a wild thinker.
Yeah.
So I really don't know what his position on astrology was. What's interesting for me is that, you know, Galileo was the pet of Urban VIII until he angered him profoundly and got, you know, booted out of his position, and then was replaced by Kierkegaard. Now, Galileo, of course, although it's not well known, was a practicing astrologer during most of his career, whereas Kierkegaard, as far as I know, was not. So all I know, once again, is that it's an interesting question, but I really don't know.
Okay. Thank you very much.
And the time is up, so let's give the hands to Darrel.